Today I have a very nice game for you from round 6 of the U.S Chess Championship between Hans Niemann and Ray Robson. Now this game has a little bit of everything. It has some good instructive moments in the opening, some interesting middle game maneuvering, and some exciting tactics to finish off the game. So you're going to want to stick around for that. So Hans Niemann with the white pieces starts with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, all very standard moves until Niemann plays bishop f4, which Robson described as a funny move in his post-game interview. This move is not very popular in conjunction with the move c4. Most players in the main London system would like to play c3 instead, but in this variation, white can get into an uncomfortable situation sometimes with this bishop b4 check move. And I'll show you just one line that demonstrates that. After d5, that's what was played in the game, if Hans Niemann would have played knight c3, in this line, black can actually take on c4 with a good position. Now the normal response from white here is to play e4 and get the big center, threatening to recapture that pawn immediately. But here, black can play bishop b4, threatening to take on e4 since this knight is pinned. And the most popular way for white to deal with this threat is to counterpin with bishop g5. But you can see that in this line, since the bishop has already gone to f4, white has had to take 2 moves to put the bishop to g5 instead of 1. If instead of playing bishop f4 earlier, knight f3 had been played, we'd have this position with black to move. So white loses a tempo in this line. But in the game, Niemann takes the pawn on d5, and now we got knight takes d5. Again, this position would favor white if the bishop was not on f4. White could play e4, giving that knight a kick, getting his ideal pawn center. But since the bishop is under attack, Niemann needs to take a move to deal with that. He plays bishop to g3, and Robson immediately strikes in the center with c5. Now the top computer choice here is d takes c5, but Niemann plays this e4 move, which is interesting also. Kicking the knight off its central square, after knight to f6, 1 pawn's threatened, 2 pawns are threatened. How is Niemann going to deal with this? He decides to defend the pawn on e4, knight to d2, offering a pawn sacrifice. Robson declined taking the pawn. He said he wanted to be safe. Let's see what would have happened if he would have taken this pawn on d4. First of all, queen takes d4 would not be a good way to grab the pawn, because after knight to f3, white develops another piece with tempo attacking the queen, and after the queen moves, black is falling pretty far behind in development. So best would be c takes d4 if you're going to take the pawn. And now Robson was worried about the following moves from white. He mentioned e5. This kicks the knight away from the king side. Knight to d5. It can go to the center, but then white will develop with knight f3, and he's going to put his bishop on d3. Those are the moves Robson mentioned. e5, knight f3, and bishop d3. Black does have an extra pawn in this position, but it is well blockaded, and it cannot be defended by another pawn. It could be won at some point by white. Furthermore, this knight has been kicked away from the king side. So the king side where black would like to castle is a little more vulnerable to attack now, with this strong bishop eyeing that side of the board. This pawn also kind of hinders the development of this dark squared bishop. c5 would be a lot better square for this bishop if this pawn was not here blocking it. We'll see in the game the bishop does go to c5 without the pawn here, and that's actually better for black. So for those sorts of reasons, Robson declines the pawn. He just plays knight c6. Now he's threatening to take the pawn with the knight, which would actually be favorable for black. So at this point, Niemann decides to take on c5. Bishop takes c5, and now he pushes ahead with e5. Knight goes to d5. Knight g to f3. Black castles, and now a3 by Niemann. That's a very useful move. He wants to play knight to e4, which is what he does on his next move, hitting the bishop. But if he hadn't played a3 first, there'd be a bishop b4 check from black. He also doesn't want this bishop to be attacked once it moves to d3 with knight b4. So it's very useful to keep a piece off of the b4 square. b6 now from Robson. He doesn't want to develop this bishop to the passive d7 square. He's looking to play bishop a6 and eliminate white's light squared bishop. In this position, white's light squared bishop is definitely superior to black's, because it's going to be eyeing the king side, which doesn't have a lot of pieces over there to help defend it. So it's a good plan to try to trade off those bishops. Knight e4 by Niemann, and Robson plays the best move here. He plays a5. He's not so worried about Niemann giving up his beautifully centrally placed knight for his bishop, because after this transformation, You might think, okay, black's got a weak pawn on c5, but white also has a weak pawn, and black has an open file for his rook. Robson correctly assessed that this would be better than losing a tempo by moving his bishop out of the view of the knight. So it's the correct move to play a5. There's not going to be any b4. So, rook to c1. Niemann just decides to increase the pressure. Knight c to e7. Just backing up his beautifully placed d5 knight. Also, this knight here was undefended, and there was a rook on that open file, so it wasn't the most secure place for that knight to hang out. Bishop d3. Niemann wisely chooses to finish his development in castle rather than taking on c5 and winning the pawn. Queen b6 would come with tempo. You know, you could see something like this. Knight f5. Robson said in the post-game interview he wasn't too worried about a position like this for black with these two beautifully placed knights. He said he believed he had compensation for the sacrificed pawn, and he was correct according to the engine. But after Niemann plays bishop d3, there's bishop a6, the best move. Niemann has no good way to avoid exchanging those bishops. Obviously, you don't want to go back this way because then you won't be able to castle. So he decides to take on a6, and after rook takes, that bishop trade has been good for black, but that rook is in a little bit of an awkward position. He can only move backwards for the moment. So black's going to have to get that rook back in the game somehow. Niemann castles. We got queen to a8. I thought that looked like a strange move at first until I realized that this knight has no protection. So there is some idea of a discovered attack if this knight moves somewhere. Niemann obviously is aware of that, and he plays rook to e1, adding some protection to that knight. Now we got knight f5 from Robson, placing his knight on a beautiful square. That post is especially nice for the knight considering that white's light squared bishop's gone. There's not going to be any threat of a bishop taking that knight anymore. Niemann plays knight to h4 here. Robson said he couldn't predict this move. The computer likes it alright though. I think it's its second choice. Just looking to eliminate that beautifully placed knight. So Robson says, okay, I might as well grab a bishop for my knight and mess up your pawn structure a little bit. And now Robson decides to get his bishop out of the view of this knight. There's fewer pieces on the board. Maybe he doesn't want to sack a pawn anymore. And now Niemann gets ultra aggressive with queen to h5. Might have some idea of playing knight g5 at the right moment, which would threaten checkmate in 1. But this isn't too dangerous for Robson. He just goes ahead with b5. Maybe he wants to play b4 and hope this file opens. It also prepares rook c6, getting the rook back into the game. Knight to f3 played by Niemann. Now he's eyeing g5 with two pieces, two knights, and maybe he'll put the knight to d4. Rook to c6 played, and now Niemann makes a very interesting decision. He gives up control of the only open file. Robson says, okay, I will infiltrate and start targeting these queenside pawns. Niemann plays b3, rook a2, just looking to eliminate that pawn there. Knight d4 by Niemann, defending b3, putting the knight to a nice square, hitting b5. Rook takes a3, and now Niemann gets ultra aggressive with f4. After this move, the engine says the game has tipped heavily in black's favor. But I can see why Niemann would want to make that move. He's going all out for a kingside attack. The engine actually likes queen to g4 better, and this move actually carries a threat. See if you can see what white's threat is in this position. If it were white to move again, the threat is knight takes e6. After pawn takes, queen takes e6 with check, king moves, and we grab the knight on d5. So black would need to address that. The engine's suggesting king h8. And now white can play knight d6. It's a very aggressive post for that knight. It's dangerous to let it stay there. You can take it out with the bishop. But now white's got this passed pawn. And in some lines can even still sacrifice the knight. For example, this computer line, queen to d8. White can sack here, sack the piece, and then this knight's hit, so it has the chance to move since black's not in check, but then d7, and the computer says white has compensation here for sacking that knight because of this advanced pawn. And this rook's kind of out of the game for a minute. So it's an interesting computer line, but let's look at what happened in the game. f4. The problem with this is there's rook a2 from Robson, targeting g2. The rook and the queen are lined up to deliver checkmate. All that needs to happen is two pieces need to get out of the way. So let's see if Robson can make that happen. Now here Niemann makes his final blunder. He just barrels ahead with f5. He's going all out for checkmate. The engine says he really needed to play knight takes b5 because this c3 square needs more protection. Because after what Niemann played, f5, there's knight to c3. This knight cannot capture that knight, or there will be a checkmate on g2. This knight is hitting this rook and threatening to win this knight. So Niemann's best move here is probably just to defend the knight. He decides to just barrel forward with f6 and just hope he can checkmate black before black can checkmate him. But sadly, it doesn't happen because Robson here finds his only winning move. All his other moves lose, but there is one move that gives him the win. See if you can spot it. Bishop takes f6 is absolutely necessary. Before we see what happens after that move, let's look at black's alternatives and why they fail. G takes f6, pawn takes. Threatening the bishop, threatening to checkmate with queen g5 followed by mate. How are you going to deal with this? You take out the pawn? Well, this is going to lead to a mate in 5. After knight takes f6 check, king goes to g7. The move here is knight f5 check. It's the quickest mate. There's other ways too. But after king takes f6, we got queen h6 check. King takes f5. Looks crazy. White's just giving up all his material. But here, white has a mate in 2. See if you can find it. It begins with rook e5 check, king takes, and then queen to f4 mate. Beautiful finish. So that's what happens if you take with the bishop there. Okay, what happens if king h8 is played? Here, of course, we take the bishop, and we're hitting the rook. So if you do something like knight takes e4, obviously we just take the rook, queening our pawn with check. That's no good. If you move the rook to g8, there's queen to e5 check. Rook has to go in the way. We take on e6 with the knight. After the pawn takes, we got rook d8. Look who's losing their queen. So that's a nice combination. Let's say, instead of moving the king, knight takes e4 here. Of course, this runs into queen g4, king moves. Queen g7 is mate, that's not working. So that's what happens when you take on f6 with a pawn. If you don't capture on f6, and instead play something like knight takes e4, we'll take the bishop. And if rook e8, now there's queen to f3. The knight's attacked by 2 white pieces. If you move it out of the way, there's queen takes, rook takes, knight c6, and how are you stopping rook d8? No good defense to that. And finally, if there's some beginner watching that's wondering about g6, queen h6, checkmate will be unavoidable on g7. So, bishop takes f6 was the move, the only winning move. And Niemann plays knight takes f6 check. Here, if you try e takes f6, there's just knight takes e4, and you don't have a checkmate. Try to line something up like this, there's just knight takes. No checkmate for you. So you got to try something crazy like knight to f6 check, sacking a knight so that you can land a pawn on f6 hopefully, but not yet, because now that your knight has moved, guess what's being threatened? Checkmate. So Niemann throws his knight in the way first, knight to f3, and here Robson just grabs the exchange, takes on d1. Niemann throws in e takes f6, so he's threatening checkmate here. For example, if you try to move that knight, there's this. King must move and checkmate, so that must be addressed. And Robson does so by moving the king out of the way, so this move does not come with check. Niemann now, sadly, has to just take the knight on d1. If he tries queen g4, now there's rook g8, defending the g7 square, no checkmate. So after he takes on d1, rook g8, hitting g3, king defends, queen to e4, looking to come in here, and checkmate, would also be hitting the rook. Rook d7, played by Niemann, hoping he can take that pawn and checkmate black or do something. But unfortunately, queen to e2, threatening checkmate, and now this pawn must be defended. Niemann does so with queen to h3. A little tactics training for any of you beginners watching What Should Black Play. Queen takes knight, this pawn is pinned. meaning that knight was undefended. Here Niemann plays rook takes f7, but after rook takes g2 check, has to resign, because if the queen takes, you got queen h5 check, and once that check's dealt with, the rook is picked up. Black is a piece up. So a very pleasing game from round 6 of the U.S Chess Championship. I really enjoyed watching Niemann go all out for an attack, which was just maybe a move too slow. Robson's counterattack just got there first. And I gotta say, it was a very human looking performance by both players. We had a good mix of some top computer moves and some very human inaccuracies. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel for more quality analysis coming your way soon.